Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon to those of you in the UK. Welcome to today's WTG webinar session. My name is Akil Hassan, and I will be moderating today's event. Our topic today is the Consumerisation of Talent, a roadmap to employee engagement and retention strategies, and will be presented by Nick Hensley and Rob Catalano. Before we begin, please let me quickly explain the various tools available during today's session. This session is using audio broadcast, so you should be hearing me through your computer speakers or headphones. If for any reason you have a problem with the audio, please send me a message via the chat box to the right, and I will enable your dial-in details. You may also have noticed that you can only see your own name in the panel in the participants list, as well as your own chat messages and messages from the panelists. This is down to the purposes of privacy, and there are many of your peers and colleagues from around the world, again joining anonymously. If you need assistance, please contact me through the chat box, and if you would like to pose a question to the speakers, then please use the question and answer box. Simply type your question, and we will do our best to get through as many questions as possible. This leaves me with nothing more to say, but to welcome today's presenters and hand over the floor. Rob Catalano, you are now live.
Wonderful, thank you. So thanks, Akil. First off, I also want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. It's going to be an exciting next 50 to 60 minutes. And what I wanted to do before getting started and handing it over to Nick and giving him a good introduction is also just introduce myself. So my name is Rob Catalano. I currently run the engagement on expansion from Achievers out of the UK, and I spend a lot of time helping companies with their engagement strategies. And part of this conversation today is really just to do that and talk about how things are shifting in the workplace and how we need to react and consider new initiatives. What we're going to talk about today is really get Nick starting us off talking about recent research from the Henley Business School and really bringing that discussion into the similarities of how employees and consumers are today based on what we want to talk about, which is that consumerization of the talent. But then we're going to focus on where we should focus our efforts and how now is the time to react, and then end it off with really 4 enablers of employee engagement to get people thinking about how they can implement this into their workplace. So the first thing I want to do before starting the agenda is hand it over to Nick Hensley. And I've had the pleasure of meeting Nick a while ago, and he's a great guy, a lot of great insight, and no doubt comes from a lot of his experience. Highly experienced HR practitioner. He's led organizational development, resourcing, talent and leadership, performance, learning and development, basically everything in the HR space, and has done so in a major number of businesses, including Mars, Prudential, British Oxygen, Travelport, and others. And what he does is he works with boards and with HR on many topics to drive successful businesses. And he does that right now also as part of a co-director of the Henley Business School Center for HR Excellence. And quite deservingly, he was awarded last year's visiting professorship. So I now call him Professor Nick Hensley. So I'll hand it over to you, Nick, and you can walk us through the beginning of the webinar.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks, Rob, for the introduction. I'm not going to add to really the introduction around myself. I'm just going to go straight into some of the content here, and I'm going to talk till about 1/2 the hour, and then I'm going to hand back to Rob, and then hopefully we'll have 10-15 minutes at the end for you guys to ask some questions that hopefully we can field for you. So let me just give you a feel for what I'm going to talk about today. As Rob already mentioned, we're looking at some recent research that we've been doing around talent management from the Henley HR Center, and this has really been centered on trying to see how talent models have evolved through the recent financial crisis, and whether we've come out the other side kind of the same way we went in, or whether some things have changed. And what we see here as well is there's a number of trends, some of them quite macro level trends in HR. One of the things which I've noticed quite evidently through the research that I've been involved in, but also just practitioner work with organizations around the world, is that there are some clear questions emerging for HR if we combine these trends rather than look at them as individual trends. And I'll talk some more about that a little bit as we go through. The upshot of this is that I believe there are some quite fundamental challenges to some of the underlying assumptions and approaches that we use in talent management. And that's not to say that we're doing all the wrong things. That's just to say that maybe the time is right to just have a good long look at how we're really going at the talent world, and maybe be prepared to evolve some of those approaches to suit some of these trends. And you'll see that one of the key trends, or how these trends come together, is really giving us some very strong clues about how we should maybe interact with talent in a slightly different way. So that's really what we're going to go through today. I want to talk a little bit more about some of these trends, and you will, I would imagine, recognize some or all of these trends perhaps as individual elements. But I want to paint this picture of how they fit together and how they sit as some causal factors behind what I see as a real shift in the talent market. The first of these is really to just talk a little bit about employee-centric markets. So in other words, how is the balance of power shifting between employees with the skills that we need and employers who want to utilize those skills? And those of you like me who've been around the talent game for a few years will remember the times when we used to flick forward and back from employee-centric markets where really the talent themselves had the power to employer-centric markets where actually you could argue that some people were perhaps lucky to work for you. And I'm exaggerating for effect, but that's kind of how it felt sometimes, the balance of power shifting maybe every 3, 4, 5 years. And that used to be a regular cycle and was repeated in many areas around the world. What seemed to happen about the time that we started emerging from the financial crisis was that it flicked back to an employee-centric market, and it kind of stayed there in many areas. Not all, but a large number of sought-after skills. And so I think we have in the backdrop this growing power that those with the talent critical to our strategies could have moving forward. And there are a number of factors that sit around that I'm going to just talk about a little bit more. So that's one factor. Another factor is this piece about the portfolio career. Many of you will recognize that term. For those of you who don't, it's really about how individuals more and more are thinking of their career as having a large number of different elements, a bit like a jigsaw, that they fit together over time. And that could involve them working with or for quite a large number of organizations. There are various estimates that are kicking about that people coming into employment now would work for between 15 and 30 organizations over their career. I don't think, I don't really know exactly which end of that spectrum is most likely, but overall the view is that people will be working for a larger number of organizations. And this is not something which is specific to people in the younger demographic coming into our organizations now. This is also something which is a rising way of thinking and behaving in our organizations right now across the age demographic and across the sectors. So again, you've got another trend there that we may recognize. What else? Well, lower barriers to moving employment. Now, this is not going to be the same in every market. I'll be the first to realize that, but certainly in a number of markets, barriers to moving are beginning not to disappear, but to be lowered significantly, particularly what's viewed as acceptable tenure in an organization. When I started work, way back now, 25 to 30 years ago, if you moved organization without having spent 6, 8, 10 years there, people looked at your CV and said, well, what happened there? Nowadays, well, it's a bit different. I had a group of resourcing directors in a room a few months back, and I asked them what would be the minimum time spent in an organization below which you would start to ask some questions, and pretty much unanimously they came back saying, well, 2 years really. So we've got some shifts there. It is a little bit easier to move employer. There's almost an expectation that people will, if you combine it with the rise in portfolio career thinking, you can begin to see that this is something that is going to happen more and more. We also add into the mix skills shortages. When we look at our business strategies, there is a growing dependency on specific skill sets. In some cases, the dependency is quite acute, as is the gap. For example, chemical engineering, mining engineering are two good examples. But those of you who have digital elements to your strategies or e-commerce, omni-channel, etc., there are some real risks out there in terms of the availability of digital marketing skills, for example. And also they would be a good example of a demographic who really got on top of this whole piece about being employee-centric, and they know their worth and they're not afraid to throw their weight around. So I think many organizations are underestimating some of the challenges there. And this piece about personal brand equity, this goes hand in hand with the rise in portfolio thinking, but what we're really talking about here is a growing awareness of brand, of your CV pedigree, and of what some people are calling Me Inc. In other words, a personal brand that an individual builds across a number of different employers with a view to cashing in on that equity at some point, either in terms of salary or in terms of position, as they go through their career. As if these weren't enough in isolation, when we start putting them together and then we catalyze it by another trend, which is actually organizations pushing more and more career management into the hands of the individual and encouraging them to manage their own careers, to really come to the organization and say, these are my aspirations, this is how I want to develop myself, and to take more ownership for that. In a way, this is fueling the whole system. What we seem to be seeing more and more, therefore, is a growing degree of discretionary relationship in the match between employees and employers. And what I mean by that is a move away from the master and servant feeling that has been in some areas of the job market over the past years into much more of what's being termed an exchange of mutual value. So in other words, we will be together as employee and employer for as long as it makes sense in both directions. I'm going to give you my skills and you're going to give me something that I need. And when that relationship either is forced to break down or actually is proactively moved on, then we'll part and I'll be off to take my skills elsewhere to get another piece of my career jigsaw, and you'll be left trying to replace me. And this is very much the trend in terms of the way or attitude that talent is beginning to develop in terms of its relationship with employers. And not just that, but also attitudes to work itself in terms of the hours that people wish to work, where they wish to do that work, the tools with which they want to do that work, how they like to be managed, and so forth. So what you have here are a number of different trends which we perhaps will recognize individually, perhaps will recognize in combination. But when we put them all together and then we catalyze it by this digital enablement that we've seen, the ability to use social media, the ability to spread good and bad news about employers at the touch of a button, the ability to check out employers via various web-based review sites, the ability to career network via the use of well-known web-based tools. What we have here are some fuel for the fire. So what I'm trying to paint here is a picture that says there are a number of trends which together are beginning to move in a particular direction because they are feeding off of one another and creating this kind of cycle which takes us in a particular direction. And the direction it takes us in, interestingly, is consumerism. And what do I mean by that phrase? What I mean is that if you were to write down a list of the kind of behaviors that the talent that we need to deliver our strategies is beginning to exhibit, beginning to show in its interactions with employers, and you were to write down a list of behaviors that you or I might demonstrate just as normal consumers in the retail world or wherever, there's really not that big a difference between them. And I take the example of the automotive industry. So if we're sitting there thinking, well, we want to go out and buy a new car, generally we have a sense that we know what we're looking for. We want a sedan, or we want a station wagon or estate, 4x4, whatever it is. We have a sense of what we're looking for. And you know what? This is exactly the same with portfolio career thinkers, that they know what it is they need to get from this current employment and from their next employment. Brand is important in the same way that you may have an aspiration around a particular brand, a motor vehicle, and you may not wish to go backwards in terms of perceived brand. Well, you know what? It's the same with employers. There are certain employers that look good on your CV, that build your personal brand equity, and people are very consciously trying to get the gene pool of their CV to a particular point. In addition to this, we have buying power. I mean, nobody's forcing me to buy a car. Nobody's saying exactly where I have to buy it. And actually, in the world of a talent-centric market, this is true as well. I know what my skills are worth. I do have some choice as a career consumer, and I want a good deal. I'm not necessarily just going to sit there and say, sure, you just tell me how much the job pays, you just tell me the benefits, you just tell me all the deals around it, and I'll just say yes. Actually, what I'm likely to say now is, well, you know what? I want that, but I want something else, or I want to do it from home, or I want to do it in this kind of way, or can you change the job content? There's more and more of this cherry picking going on with people who realize that their skills are in short supply and are not afraid to negotiate. This piece about wanting to choose from the options list, again, if I'm buying a car, I don't just buy a basic car, I want to add some bits and pieces onto it. Well, we already see some of this in the career world with flexible benefits schemes, which I think are probably our first foray into the world of consumerism for talent in organizations. But more and more people are wanting to optimize and to specify the terms around which they work, whether that be throwing in a travel pass, or whether that be working from home on Thursdays or whatever. There is a growing feeling with those who have really critical skills that actually you do need me more than I need you. So I'm not suggesting that there's necessarily a really bad arrogance out there, but I think just a recognition that people can go elsewhere, that actually you can change allegiance in the same way that you can with a motor vehicle. Just because I bought a particular brand doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to buy that brand next time. Or actually, if I'm having a bad experience with that, I can sell it and move on. And I think there's this piece around choice now, with many people holding down more than one offer, for example, going into employment. I know a lot of organizations who think they've hired someone only to find out at the last minute that they've gone somewhere else. So what we've got here really is a situation where there are some similarities. I'm exaggerating for effect, but there's some real similarities between just retail consumer behavior and also talent behavior in terms of career consumption. And here's the rub. When we go into our organizations and we walk down the hall to marketing and we say, well, what do we do about this? Well, we know what to do about this. We understand the rules, the steps, the activities that we need to put in place. The question is, to what degree do we understand this from a talent perspective? To what degree are we putting in place measures that deal with this growing trend? And to what degree are the models that we have in place actually playing to an old tune? Hopefully you can read this slide, but if you were to write down some classical marketing flowchart, if you like, here, around having a particular strategy, looking at how that relates to consumers, segmenting their needs, and then developing a proposition off the back of that meets or aims to meet those needs, thinking about how we take that to market in terms of channel and platform, developing a whole load of brand activity to sit behind it, and then having some kind of measurement in place. This then underpins by some market insight work to really try and understand what it is people want, a whole stream around developing product and service offer, platform development, and a marketing strategy. Now, if we took this slide into any marketing function, they'd say, oh yeah, this is what we do every day. Now, if you believe that there's a big similarity between actually the way that some talent is behaving and the way that we actually interact with the consumers of our products and services, this is also a model for HR. This is also a model that says, well, why aren't we then understanding what's the talent that we need to deliver our strategy, actually going out and finding out what it needs, segmenting that audience and developing propositions that sit behind that that's going to appeal to that audience, it's going to attract them, it's going to retain them, and putting in place the routes to market, whether they be social media or otherwise, putting in place some product and service offer development, which in the HR world would be about how we do development, how we recruit, how we develop talent, how we manage performance, our people processes, if you like. And really putting all that together within a marketing strategy that more and more we're calling employer value proposition, and then putting in place some metrics to help us understand how well we're doing. Now, it seems to me we're a long way from that in HR right now. And this is a big question I really think we should think about. Do we have this kind of marketing mindset and skill in HR? And I'll tell you now, I'm doing some research around employer value proposition right now, and I've come across a number of quite well-known organizations who've taken the employer value proposition out of HR and put it in marketing because they're saying, well, you know what? It's the same as our consumer brand, and this is where we have the skills. So I think it's an interesting wake-up call for HR, but also I think it's important that when we look at our processes and the way we currently interact with talent, which I'm just showing on the next slide here, that we look at the underlying assumptions that we're really operating to, and we say, well, how well do they compare with this view of the world? If you look at, for example, assumptions around how long people will be in our organization, the question would be, how many of your organizations, or in how many of your organizations, are you really betting on people staying for the long term? Are you hoping in terms of the break-even, or are you hoping in terms of the value you need to extract that they'll stay 5-10 years? The question is, well, will they? I've seen succession plans that talk about successor in 5 years plus. Well, is that even a valid comparison to make? Maybe some of your talent is going to be here for 2 years and then it's going to move on. There's a tendency as well to look at career in a completely different way that talent looks at a career. If talent is looking at career as being multi-company or multi-organization, why are we looking at it as being within one organization? Should we not be really conspiring with this and saying, well, how can we develop people across organizations? Can we form development partnerships with other organizations? Can we actually develop someone up to a particular point, have them leave our organization, and plan for them to return at some point in the future? Wouldn't that be interesting? We also need to look at some of the basics. If talent is exhibiting consumer behaviors, how many times are we stopping ourselves from getting the talent that we need simply because we run into issues around inflexible pay ranges, where we say, well, you know what, we really need these guys, but we can't pay someone at band X this amount of money. Well, you know what, if that's the market cost, if you won't pay it, someone else will. How flexible are our management approaches, really? How flexible are our policies? If we want people to think about working for us more than once in their career, we need to begin to come to the table on things like continuous service definitions in terms of pensions. How flexible is flexible working? Well, many of you will have flexible working policies, but how flexible is it really? Often working part-time might be doing 5 days working 3. How many companies are doing part-time term time? I think these are all valid questions. I'd also throw in here about the data that we collect. Many organizations are collecting data from inside their organization, from existing employees. How many are going outside the organization in the same way a marketing function would, and saying, what are the people we want to target as potential future employees? What do they need? What do they want? What do they know about us? And we have a tendency to fall on these rather mass market engagement tools, when really, if we're treating talent as consumers, we need some way of also getting to that individual, that specific dialogue with an employee that helps us understand their individual needs. When it comes to social media, I think it's fair to say that many HR functions are dipping their toe in the water, but there is a fear of opening Pandora's box. We are going to have to get on top of our strategy for social media in the next couple of years. If we don't, we are going to find the talent world intermediated by organizations who we will, I'm sure, all know of, who are much better at doing this. So here's the question. If we look long and hard and honestly at some of the assumptions underpinning our current approaches to talent, yeah, sure, some of those will be spot on, and some of them will be future-proof, but some of them might be really based on some assumptions which are really a bit outmoded now. And it really comes down to some critical elements. Do we really have meaningful dialogue with talent in our organizations or outside of our organizations? And that really brings the manager relationship into the foreground. Do we focus on individual needs versus one size fits all? We have to balance an economy, obviously. We can't have specific policies set up for individuals. But to what degree do we try to create one answer for everybody's needs? And to what degree can that ever work if we are actually dealing with different segmentation and different needs within our employee population? And then, are we developing aligned propositions? Are we really, in the same way we would for our consumers of our products and services, really understanding what it is people want and then making sure that we're developing a policy and process approach that will really deliver against that? These are all valid questions, and I think they're all questions that I'd encourage you to take away with you today to begin to unpack a little bit, because what this is saying to me is it's shifting the focus for things like engagement. It's shifting it away from perhaps some of the harder, more tangible elements, and it's beginning to increase the importance of things like talent insights. In other words, really trying to understand what is it that talent wants and to build that into our proposition. It's really trying to focus on line managers, because line managers ready-made infrastructure who can bridge that gap between the mass market approach and the individual need of talent in the organization. It's beginning to say, if you're not investing in your employer value proposition now, you should probably start doing that. And it's also really raising this issue of non-financial recognition. If we have a discretionary relationship more and more as we go into the future, what makes someone stay at an organization or stay in that mutual exchange of value shifts as well. And part of that has to be a move to different kinds of recognition. So to just finish off, I see really 5 areas, and there's probably more, but 5 big areas that I would see as being very profitable for organizations and HR functions to look at and to focus on. I say 5, I can actually see 4 on the slide, but bear with me. The first one is better line management, better basic line management. Now, this is something we talk about a lot. I think if we believe the consumer behaviors here, we are really going to have to focus very, very strongly on the ability of our line managers to enter into a meaningful dialogue with talent and to really, really carry across our brand this is saying to me that we can no longer continue with the old adage that the only part of your job you're allowed to be bad at is managing people. It's really going to become hyper important. And I think that employee dialogue has got to become much more specific and much more frequent. We're saying here we can't really rely on the once per year annual appraisal as the only time that a manager really sits down with an employee and talks to them properly. I think as well that exploration of aspirations and what the employee wants should be part of that as well. A higher volume of less formal recognition is also part of the equation here. How do you keep that discretion relationship alive in ways that are meaningful to employees? And actually, some of that is going to be quite specific and more than just financial. And then getting greater insight from your talent data. This is really going to help inform the products and services and policies and processes that you put behind all of this. And the fifth point, which I'm not sure has come across on this slide, is really then a less tentative approach to social media, that really we need to get over our fear or pay someone who can do this better than us to do it for us. Otherwise, we are going to find ourselves more and more being intermediated, and we will have to begin to pay companies to talk to talent is a potential disaster scenario here. So this really is a brief dip into quite a large topic. What I really wanted to get across here was to get you guys questioning what you see and saying, do I recognize any of these trends? Putting them together and really looking long and hard at your processes, your policies, and saying, are they really future-proof, or are they actually built around assumptions which aren't valid anymore in a different talent world post-recession? And what does that mean? So I'm going to hand back across to Rob now. He's going to build on this a little bit. But I hope you found that interesting. Rob and I are both happy to explore this with you subsequent to today. But Rob, let me just hand across to you now.
No, I appreciate it, Nick. Thank you. And what's interesting about this topic, and the reason why I'm so interested, is that I've had the luxury of being in the human capital management space for the last decade, but I've also, by trade, have been a marketer. So when I think about the things that are happening and the shift from this talent perspective to more of a consumerism aspect, is something that I physically have seen in the last number of years in terms of this shift. And what I want to share is something that I actually saw at an event recently that Gartner showed, and it was really discussion around how on the left there's different systems and strategies and technologies that are focused around that customer relationship and focusing on the consumer. But now we're starting to see some of these things, make their way into talent, and we must find a way to get these types of things into talent, especially if the market is shifting and the employee perspective is shifting, just like Nick talked about. So, for example, on the left, the focus on customer engagement has been a standard practice for the last 15 years with the advent of CRM technologies. But just now we're starting to see the value of employee engagement on the right. Right? We track it more thoroughly, but I think we're still scratching the surface, and we have a lot of work to do on this. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but look at something like the second thing on that list: personalized and contextual marketing. Right? That's the way, from a marketing standpoint, that's the way we get attention of our current and prospective customers. Right? Think about how many times you were browsing the web and you see very specific ads that are showing up at you. Right? And we've all had that garment or pair of shoes that we looked at one site and wondered why it's showing up on completely different sites, like it's following you. But it works, and companies are starting to have those personalized messages. But we haven't seemed to get there from an employment standpoint. I also like using the example of customer sourcing and listening signals. Right, from a marketing perspective, we spend a lot of time finding out what people are doing on our website and what they're doing and serving up very relevant content. But are we doing that on the employee side? Right? Wouldn't it be great to actually have insight into listening signals for who are high potentials in the organization? Or are people conducting conversations or reading or learning that may make them a future leader or partner in the company? So you get the idea, but the real reality is that when it comes to this world right now, we talk about spending a lot of dollars on human capital management software, and this is some research done by Gartner as well. But there's a gap in terms of what we view as our employees as our most important assets to what we're investing on the consumer side, right? As you can see, there's about 4 times what's being spent right now in customer relationship management technology versus what we're spending on employees, and it starts getting us thinking of what the priorities really are. So I wanted to add that perspective before diving into being time to act. And the reality is that the problem's always going to be there, right? We will be hard pressed to not only recruit but also engage and retain the talent within our companies. But as the technology is changing and the work environment is changing rapidly, as we're talking about, the approaches and the solutions to those problems, change as well. So it's really time to act. And to what Nick said, we have to reflect on our current practices at the moment, and if they're future-proof, if they're things that are actually going to be relevant to the current workplace. So what's interesting is that there was a study did from the Corporate Executive Board, and if you haven't heard of CEB, they have some interesting research on the HR front. But what they asked major heads of HR was what their priorities were going to be going to last year. And engagement and retention were number one, similar to what we're talking about in terms of how do we engage and retain this ever-shifting employee profile. So if you're looking at it as a priority in your business, that's great. But if you're not, it may be worth considering this as a focus. But the reason why I bring this up in terms of why companies are focusing on engagement and retention of their employees and trying to, again, future-proof their strategies, it's because, if you ask yourself why, it's because it works, right? Best companies to work for, highly engaged workforces, produce better results. Right, this is a chart from the best companies. It's a list of UK organizations that are great places to work, and it's based on surveys that the researchers send directly to their employees to complete. But what you see in red is that the return rates of these best companies, the return rates of these highly engaged organizations, compared to all other companies on the FTSE 100, for example, more than 2.5 times the value. So again, this whole idea is that when you have engaged employees, it provides positive business results, and which is what we all fundamentally want with our HR practices. Now, the most exciting part, and the reason why I get very very excited about the HR space and some of the things that we can do here, is that I think today HR leaders and organizations are actually starting to realize that HR has the ability to make an impact not only on engagement, but also the success and results of the business. And what I'm showing on the screen here is the service profit chain, right? And what it's meant to illustrate is this. If employees are conducting the right behaviors and are engaged at the top, then customers will enjoy their experience and become repeat customers, right? And then when customers are having a great experience, they come back, give repeat business, and the shareholder value will be impacted positively. And if it's not shareholder value, it's however success of the organization is measured. And when that happens, success gets employees energized, and it makes the model continue round and round, right? It's the basic principle that employee success leads to customer satisfaction, which leads to profitable business results. And why do I think HR's opportunity is now? It's because this all starts with focusing on employees first. And what I mean by that is companies can't really fundamentally change customer loyalty and shareholder value in a short period of time. Those are outputs, right? But what we can change is the input, the employees, right? The individual behaviors, the individual values that they live every day, the ability to build and innovate products or services for your customers to drive success forward. And at the end of the day, enact the company strategies that are important. So I think what's important is it's a truly exciting time because we have the ability to start impacting, shareholder value and customer satisfaction based on employee behaviors and the types of initiatives and strategies and focus that HR puts into the business. And I think it's starting to happen. Right, I think there's a bit of excitement around this space because we're starting to see a shift from the HR focus to more of a company focus to more of a people focus. And let me show you what I mean with what's on the screen here. Right, I actually urge everyone to ask yourself where in your company or HR department you find yourself playing in these three approaches. But first, are you focused solely on core HR or internal HR practices and technology? Which provides much less value to the organization, but perhaps more value to HR. Are you on the left side of this in terms of your HR strategies and initiatives? Or second, is your focus more on the company and talent management? Again, it provides a lot of value in terms of building great employees to drive the company forward. Or third, are your employees really focused around the employees and engaging them? And if we fundamentally believe everything that was said on the last slide about a direct link from engaged employees and successful business results, then that's where companies are starting to buy in and actually conduct a lot of their strategies. And what I mean with this, with actual stories, is ask yourself in the last 3 years what enterprise-wide initiatives that you've engaged in, and see where they land in these 3 buckets to get a sense if you need to consider a new approach. So did you implement, a new HRIS system and payroll in the last 2 years? And ask yourself, does that really make the employee experience better? Does it make the HR experience better, the company experience better? And it starts giving you a sense of where you are in this matrix. Now, if I looked at this matrix years ago versus today, I think the future of HR and business is very promising, right? I think companies are starting to move their focus to people, but I think not all companies have made that leap yet. In fact, I think a lot of HR departments are still in that core HR phase, right, that focus on the self-serving programs, in-house process improvement, and unfortunately spending a lot of their cycles there and aren't seeing an impact in the organization. I think actually most organizations are in the second phase, which are really trying to make HR strategically about the company and focusing on managing talent, again, to drive the company goals. But again, several forward-thinking companies are starting to buy into the change at the next level and seeing a lot of value from it in my experience. So again, ask yourself where in the HR department is on the scale and where you really want it to go, and reevaluating how you want to react to what's changing in terms of the employee profile, especially in this concept of consumerization. The other point I'll make here is just also look at how often you're interacting with your employees, right? If you're only doing annual engagement surveys or annual performance management conversation, or recognizing employees just for their 5 years of service and all other annual or quarterly HR initiatives, just remember that your employees don't work in years and quarters. They work in days and hours, right? And now the HR and business people strategies have to reflect that. Has to reflect more of a daily conversation, as Nick mentioned, not these annual type of approaches. Now, another way to help you kind of evaluate and help you on your journey to how do we focus on engaging our employees given this change in the market is really evaluate whether you think your company's either in transactional or transformational engagement practices. And what I mean by transactional is creating and evaluating surveys and responding with a set of activities and small projects and programs to try and react to the different levels of engagement that you get on a score, right? It's typically quite reactive to fixing employee scores or elements within it. So ask yourself if that's what your organization looks and feels like, or is it more on the transformational side? And what I mean by transformational is making engagement part of the strategic direction of the company, right? Making these employees understand how their daily behaviors impact the overall strategy or purpose of the organization. It involves a real understanding that employees are integral to develop and deliver, the business strategy, and a fundamental belief that really everything starts with the employee, like we talked about in terms of employees being an input to all the other outputs of an organization. Right? It requires deep belief in the power of people to contribute, right? And not just their job description, but to help the company create new and creative products and services, right? Or outstanding customer service and so on. And it's also that last point where it's a belief that our people are the solution and not the problem, right? Too often I hear employees are a cost, they're our largest cost, and they shouldn't be viewed as that. They should be viewed as an investment to grow a great organization. So at the end of the day, transformational is very proactive and built into the company strategy, which is very different than from just simply measuring and reacting quickly. So take a look at where you think you are on that front, and how your future strategies can kind of impact more on a transformation level if you're sitting in the transactional phase. And the reality is the problem is I think most organizations are spending time on the transactional, and even if I think it's more on the transactional on the measuring part of things, right? Even though we have the opportunity, we spend too much time measuring and not enough time acting when it comes to employee engagement. In fact, this quote here, there's an extension of it from Burson Research that said we spend about $400 US or 250 pounds per employee per year just on measuring, but we're not actually acting. And that's how I'll reiterate how I started the conversation today, right? Really time to act. And the other thing, what's interesting, is that we also conduct a lot of the surveys, and then we conduct the focus groups based on the survey, and then compare it to other results around the company. But we also have to think, what are we doing right now to complement that by implementing a strategy about actually impacting it and making a change in the company. And a lot of people ask, and they wonder, what type of change? What really drives employee engagement, and what should we be acting on? And there's a lot of research and information out there, and I just share some interesting data here from a recent Harvard Business Review report to look at what the most impactful employee engagement drivers were. And as you can see, right, it's about employee recognition, visibility into the company's vision, purpose, passion, alignment, all these things that contribute to the overall organization. And I think what's interesting, even from a consumer level, when you're interacting with a brand or someone is purchasing something, you're traditionally not just purchasing all the time based on what's the cheapest price. You have a relationship with that brand. You have a relationship with that product. And there's a lot of similarities between the consumer and the employee in how they make their decisions and where they actually choose to stay or switch brands or companies. And I think in many cases, this whole idea of transformational engagement, it isn't ad hoc programs. It isn't just small little initiatives. It's a collection of a company's focus on really having the employee at the center of really everything that they do. And I think when you start looking at how to implement this and how to get transformational, here's some interesting items here to consider. Now, what I wanted to end the call on was really some food for thought around 4 enablers of employee engagement. And where these 4 enablers are coming from is an organization that's called Engage for Success. I'm not sure if people are familiar with it, but Engage for Success really has a mission around helping, specifically to UK organization, helping the nation focus on engaging their employees because it actually provides business results, right? And David Cameron, a number of years ago, identified that the UK was unfortunately a little lower on engagement levels across the nation than many other large nations, and personally started to be involved in creating research around it. And I personally have been involved in helping some of their streams on really bringing this to life and really waving the flag in the nation around why this is really important. And what I wanted to share before getting into questions was they came up through a lot of their research and conversations with major brands, not only in the UK but globally, around what 4 employee engagement drivers are. And I want to share them with the team today. So the 4 are... The first one is the strategic narrative, right? That's the first engagement enabler. It's a strong strategic narrative about where the organization is coming from and where it's going, right? It gives line of sight between the job and the organization's vision if you look at it through the eyes of every employee. Using a UK example, I really like how John Lewis does this for their partnership, right? They focus a lot on their customers, and they do a lot of the research and have this very, very successful business, as we just talked about, in terms of how they interact with their consumers. But they are very specific about the principles that define how they run their business, and quote a lot of those principles are as relevant today as they were when they set it out by their founder years ago. But they make it part of the daily dialogue to engage their employees very, very often. And the result is they have a highly engaged staff, right? They have great business results. Their latest annual reports just came out a couple of months ago, and arguably came through in a very challenging retail market, given the current economic conditions. I actually urge people to go to their website and see how their purpose is stated, the videos they have about their shared passion, and all the principles that shape the expected behaviors of employees every day. And not to mention the connection between the individual employee and the company purpose and strategy. It gets back to that level of engagement, right? Engagement into the brand, into the consumer products that you have as consumers, that employees have in their organization as well. And if your company has the strategic narrative, again, that can help connect employees to the business, if not, an honest conversation with leadership about crafting this will give you the ability to positively impact employee behaviors and engagement. Right? Start having a conversation whether the purpose or strategic narrative of the business actually is hitting the employees on a daily basis. Now, the second engagement enabler is the concept of engaging managers. And this is something that Nick brought up as well. And it's really providing the managers the tools and the training and the focus to make them fantastic leaders and help them engage their employees. There's an unfortunate reality about managers. In many businesses, we promote our best individual contributors, and then we make them into our worst managers. And we lose on both fronts, right? We lose a very capable contributor, provided a lot of value to the company, and then we promote them to a management level with, at times, very little training or experience. And it's unfortunate because many employees feel that being a manager is their natural progression or next step of growth within a company, but we quite often put them there when they're not ready. And this is a main reason why we need to really engage managers, right? They see more on a daily basis on how our company operates. They see it more than the executive team. They have impact on all the frontline employees that are interacting with your product or customer every day. And managers have the ability to set the tone for supporting a culture that is engaged employees, right? And it's important that they're integral in any people strategy. So if we're thinking about what are we going to do to react to this changing environment of employees more as consumers, we have to get managers involved, right? The one thing we have to remember is that, yes, they're managers, but they're employees as well, right? And they need to be engaged in not only what the organization is doing or planning to do at a leadership level, but also be involved in implementing that out to all of their frontline employees. Now, the third enabler of engagement that Engage for Success shows is the concept of employee voice. And it's about creating an environment where people know that they can speak out about anything, whether it's things going wrong, things going right, the direction of the company, for example, and that their views are welcomed and heard. Now, I've worked with many companies that do this very well and have set up these types of structures to try and address this, and I want to share a couple of examples that I think work really well. One of my favorites is companies that do brutal fact sessions. Right? The company or the department are encouraged to provide brutal facts about the company that should be addressed. They look at them quarterly, they vote on which are most important to address, and once they define those and it's explored, it's up to executive leadership as well as other people in the organization to address it. And it builds that level of trust that an employee's voice can be heard and acted upon that really supports the idea. And that's just one example of employee voice. But companies that really understand this concept are ones that treat employees like investments, again, and not costs. Right? It's important to try and create an environment where honest communication can flow and employees are heard. And if you think about that on the consumerization side, think about how many brands are articulating their vision or purpose on social media. How many are interacting with them? Communication is flowing. One last point about employee voice is that employees can't have a voice and or react unless they're being communicated to. Right? You have to ensure your company has great communication about the positive, the challenging times, and trust them with this information. And having an understanding, good or bad, about the state of a company really brings employees together and impacts that engagement. Right? You traditionally don't buy a product as a consumer if you're in the dark and you don't know who that brand is or you don't know what they stand for. Well, as an employee, they need to understand that as well if you want them to be engaged in what your mission is as a company every day. And the last point, enabler of engagement, is integrity. And too often, companies have values that sit on their webpage or on a wall in the office, but they really aren't lived every day by leaders or employees. Right? It's not only connecting employee behaviors to the strategic narratives, but also the DNA that makes up the value set and company culture. One of my favorite examples of this is Zappos, which was an American company bought recently by Amazon. And one of their major values and behaviors is all about customer happiness and delivering that. And everything they did in their culture was to try to support the company in creating amazing customer service. And they had so many examples of this. They have a massive office, the beautiful section with the nicest view went to the customer service team. Right? Didn't go to the executives. Right? Every single employee, even if you're the most senior executive, you spend weeks on the phone in customer service before you even start your real job. Right? I think the longest recorded customer service call was about 8 hours at Zappos, and that's just because that was their belief. Right? It's what their company stood for, and was something that they focused on a day-to-day basis. So those are the four enablers. Right? A strategic narrative, engaging managers, an employee voice, and organizational integrity. And that's kind of it for me. I want to make sure we get the last kind of 6 minutes to questions. But the one thing I wanted to make a note of is we will be sharing after this all the slides from today. We also will be sharing an article that Nick wrote about this actual topic. So everyone will see that in the follow-up conversation from the WTG events team. So that's it. I want to kind of thank everyone for their attention and have the next 6 minutes to go through any questions. And I'll hand it over to the HR webinar team and see if there's any that came in through the chat.
Hi. Yeah, we got a few questions in. Thank you very much for that webinar, Rob and Nick. As Rob said, we'll just have a quick Q&A session now. So if you have any questions for Rob or Nick, then please submit them into the Q&A box at the bottom. We'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can. some questions that we did get through. I'll just read out this first one. It says, the trends presented so far seem to be characteristic of the very top tier of talent. Do they really describe the majority of talented candidates that most organizations are competing for every day?
Can I take that one, Akil?
Yeah,
Sure.
Yeah, so the answer is no. We're not just talking about here, but what we are talking about is the talent that is critical to your strategy. Now that often be roles much further down the organisation. So let me give you an example. I was just last week talking with an HR director of a well-known restaurant chain, and actually what they were describing was some of the difficulties that they have recruiting chefs to work in their restaurants. And this is not a super senior role in their organisation, but it is a very critical role. And actually the discussion was, are we thinking about careers the same way they're thinking about careers? Because actually if you think of a career from the point of view of someone who wants to be a chef, maybe they have an aspiration of building their way up to maybe they have their own restaurant one day, etc., etc. And so what is it that a spell working for a particular retail chain can provide that's going to help them with that? And this was quite an interesting conversation because actually that was not the way that the jobs were being put in front of potential candidates for these kind of roles. So it really does apply at all levels. But I tend to think about it as the talent that's most critical to your strategies. Now, talent we know is an all-inclusive term, but we certainly have evidence that shows that this is happening across the board, where there is this sort of demand-supply question around talent.
That's great, thank you. Rob, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I think that was good. I know there's a number of other questions, so I think it might be worth going through those.
Great. The next question we have is maybe we should be seeing our workforce as a portfolio of talent types, each requiring a different engagement and retention strategy.
Maybe one for us both to have a crack at here, Rob. But just my view on that. I think we, just like any consumer organisation, we've got to balance this sort of economies against the individual needs. I think at the moment our approaches are not individual enough, and I see the person whose role it is to activate the individual element is the line manager, but they need to choose from almost a menu of offers that we can gain some sort of synergies and cost effectiveness across. In the same way that if you were creating products, you wouldn't create a completely bespoke product for every customer, but you would hope to offer that customer some limited choice that will allow them to feel they're getting something that's much more specific to them within what you can cost effectively provide. And I think we could take that lesson into HR as well. Rob?
Yeah, I actually don't think companies are very far off in doing this at the moment. I think, we treat portfolio, let's call them, of different talent types, whether they're, for example, high potentials or future leaders in the company, or maybe people that aren't engaged. And I think we do treat them a bit differently, and companies do it at varying levels. And it's interesting. I mean, it's no different than what companies do with their consumer base, right? They treat their frequent flyers that are use the service more a lot different and have different communication messages to them than they do people that are flying the airline for the first time. So I do like the idea. I think you're right. I think you have to create those personas, so to speak, in kind of marketing speak, about who those individuals are, and that idea of a menu. Where do these people lie? And if they have to go to another one, what's their journey to get to that other portfolio? But I think companies are doing it now, and maybe not as much as they should.
Okay, great. And one final question. If we treat talent as customers, will they need account managers to help organizations get the most out of their retention?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So the instant reaction to that is I think it's less about the role and more about the mindset. So if we are really going to develop propositions that appeal to potential employees and professionals out there, as well as the ones already working in our organisation, we'll need to give it some kind of organisational focus. Now, whether that ends up being a specific role, well, we often have internal roles around communication and engagement. But to what degree might segmentation take us down a different route? I think it depends on the volume. But you do find this segmentation already happening in some organisations, particularly you have people whose roles are focused around what's increasingly called early talent, for example. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I think it's driven by a number of factors. And if you've got the volume and you've got the criticality, then maybe you do need to have people who are focused on specific routes to market and specific segments of the population. But I think it's more about the mindset right now and making sure this is represented in our approach to working with talent.
Yeah, I actually smiled when I saw this question because I think it's an interesting concept and idea, and something to a certain degree or level we actually did at Achievers, where our focus of our HR team, we actually don't even call it HR, we call it employee success, right? The whole focus of that team is to make every single employee successful, and that comes with certain levels of engagement that impact retention and some of the things we're talking about today, and catering to the needs of those employees similar to we cater to customers. So it's an interesting nomenclature aside in terms of being called account managers or employee success. I think it's an interesting look at what their role really is to make employees, and in kind of that third part of that matrix I was showing, focusing on the people as opposed to focusing just on the organization or just on the HR department.
Great, thank you very much, Rob and Nick. Are there any final messages to your attendees before we wrap up the session?
I mean, from me, just to say that I can see there are a load of other questions there as well. You should be looking at our email addresses. I'm certainly very happy, I'm sure Rob will be as well, to just field any questions offline that people have. Very happy to do that. And if I've got any other material that I can provide that goes into more depth or around related subjects, very happy to share some of that with people after today.
Yeah, my comment was exactly the same. If there's any additional questions, obviously we didn't address yet here, or other ones, definitely reach out. And I'm sure there's data, information, research, or examples of something that I've dealt with in the past. So I think Nick and I are on the same page on that, where we want to hear from people if there's other questions or insight or even stories about this type of concept happening in their organization today.
Great, thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us for our WTG webinar, and a big thank you to Achievers and Rob Catalano and Nick Kemsley for taking their time to give a very interesting presentation. Before I let you go, a couple of quick points. This session has been recorded and will be made available with a copy of the presentation slides in 2 days from now. We will send you an email with the link that you need. Please also take the time to fill in our post-event survey and leave your feedback. One final thanks to our sponsor, Achievers, and all live attendees. This session is now over. Goodbye, and have a great day.